Everyone, and welcome to another episode of In the Reading Corner. I'm very excited today because I love talking with our non-fiction authors, and I particularly love talking with people who know a lot about science. That's probably because my own background is in English and the arts, and today's guest can do exactly that. She is Maya Wei-Haas, and she is the author of What a Rock Can Reveal. Maya has a PhD in Earth Sciences. She worked for Smithsonian Digital News and spent 5 years as a staff writer for National Geographic. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Before we do talk about the book, I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about your background. What does, for example, having a PhD in Earth Sciences involve? Did you get to visit lots of really interesting places?
I did actually. I discovered fieldwork as an undergraduate. And so I did some field experiences, then did a program called Research Experience for Undergraduates and went to Svalbard for the summer, which was amazing. It was my first real time having an opportunity to ask my own questions and figure out ways to come up with my own answers to those scientific questions. And since then, I decided, okay, I want to do research. I want to continue on in this field. And so for my PhD work, I mainly focused on Arctic work. I continued on doing some work in Arctic Alaska, and then my PhD work focused on Alaska and then Antarctica as well. But the idea of studying the poles and how much you can really learn, there's these extremely sensitive environments. And so a lot of things that are difficult to detect when you are studying populated areas or further south are much easier to see when you're studying at the poles. And so my work mainly focused on looking at pollutants and how pollutants are breaking down in the environment. And they would actually make it to Antarctica and the Arctic. They get up into the air and then they make their way up to areas very far from parts where they're actually released. And so we were looking at what their fate was in the environment.
Most of us won't ever get the opportunity to travel to places that you've been, and neither should we really, because obviously it's important that they are preserved. But what about some of the other amazing places that you've been to?
I now work as a freelance science journalist as well as a travel guide. And so I work with National Geographic expeditions as well as Smithsonian Journeys on the travel company portion of those organizations. And I travel with the guests to various locations like Patagonia, Iceland, recently did a trip to New Zealand, and we'll be doing a trip to Alaska as well this summer. And I talk with their guests about the amazing environments that we're in throughout the trip. So we talk about how things formed, how the wildlife ended up the way they did, because all of these things have their deep roots in geologic history and the movement of continents and the collision of continents, all of that intensely shapes the environment, not just the rocks, but also a lot of the time the biology, the plant life, the animal life that you see around you. And so those stories are like the reporting that I do for media outlets, but I'm just telling those stories in person to the guests on the while we travel.
Which brings me to another question, actually. I have noticed in recent years that scientists and academics are much better at communicating to a wider audience and engaging with the public. But how does that impact how you tell a story? Because your knowledge must go so much deeper than you're actually communicating.
It's an interesting question. You have to tailor what you're talking about depending on your audience. And you might be able to get into some of that depth, yes, but the question is, what do you want your audience to take from that discussion? So some of those details and some of that depth might not be meaningful to your audience, in which case I don't necessarily try to get every single fact that I can out. I think the most important part is how you're shaping that message and tailoring that to who you're talking to. And so when you're really talking to a general audience, you're not going to tell them every single method that was used and all of the standard deviations that they came up with in the statistical analyses. Like those things are not going to be important to them. It's not going to be what they remember when they go and tell their friends. And so I like to think about my stories in terms of science are mysteries that we're trying to solve. And if you can present it as a mystery, because everything is, we start with this question, that's the mystery. And then you go on this adventure to try to figure out what the answer to that mystery is. And a lot of the time, there's a lot of funny things that happen along the way. There's a lot of missteps. There's a lot of unexpected results. And those are really the stories that we're then trying to get out there. And those are some of the most interesting parts of science. One of the things that I really try to do actually when I'm talking to a general audience or writing my stories is talk about the process of science, because I think that we so often learn about discoveries in a very linear sense. Like scientists went out to study this, found this, or scientists did this and had a breakthrough. But the reality is it's this very twisted, winding thing. Oftentimes they're happenstance discoveries. Oftentimes they're finding things that they didn't mean to find in the first place, or things go entirely wrong and they have to entirely scramble to come up with a different way to study this or alter their questions that they started with because they're now asking something else. And I think that's important for people to understand, because as we've seen, I'm experiencing the pandemic, like science is not linear. And I think when people think about it linearly, it makes it very hard to then talk about these issues in a sense that it's going to change as we learn more information.
We're here to talk about your book. First of all, tell us a little bit about how the book is organized.
So when we were thinking about this book, the idea really is to have a guide that walked through what you can learn about the environment that you're in. The envision was thinking about a kid going out into nature and asking questions, and what is looking at color, looking at texture, looking at the layers in the rock and those sorts of things. So the book starts with just some of the basic questions of what is a rock? What are minerals? Which was actually amusingly hard to define in a way that was simple enough, I felt like, for kids. When you start talking about definitions of a rock, it's an inorganic object that would, and it's, wait, what? Hold on. We need to figure out how to say that a little bit better. Yeah, so it starts with some very basics and then walks through some of the questions that would come to mind as you're looking at these rocks. What are some of the first things that you might notice? And then moving out into those stories. So what are the stories behind creation of the texture or the color, and trying to walk through different environments. As you get later in the book, we then go into the mountainous environment or rocks from space and that sort of thing.
Before we move on, I have got to ask you a burning question. What is a mineral rock?
Oh, minerals. So that's that was again when we were like, gosh, how do you say the definition of a mineral? Because a rock is basically made of minerals. This is how I like to explain it to people, because yes, there is the scientific definition of a mineral, but a lot of the time that doesn't really make sense to people. But minerals are generally, when we think of gems or crystals, they're a single thing. So it's a single type of structure that creates this crystal. So like quartz or even rubies and emeralds, each of those are individual minerals. And when you combine one or more of those together, that's when you get those rocks. So you can have a really big mineral, but when we're thinking about rocks, we're often talking about multiple minerals mixed together. So granite is something that actually is made of a bunch of different smaller minerals, things like quartz and feldspar, and each one of those has their own crystal structure and own properties.
So will granite always have the same minerals?
So there's a range of different granites. That's a good question, actually. Kitchen countertops, I think, is usually what I think of when I think of home or uses of granite. A lot of what we call granite in the kitchen countertops isn't actually technically granite. Granite does have the same mix of minerals, but different types of granite can have different amounts of each of those minerals. So you can have different looking rocks. So they might be much more white if you have a lot of a particular type of feldspar and a lot of quartz, whereas you could get darker granites if you have more smoky quartz in them, or like more pink, the Paduc place feldspars in them. So you can get different looks to the rocks that are all within that bigger category, but it is the same types of minerals. It's just the composition will change.
I can't wait to go out and pick up a rock and start looking at its different colours. So you've definitely done your job there, I think. I thought what we might do is have a look at some of the spreads in the book, the stories, the journeys. If I pick a couple of spreads, and then maybe I'll ask you to pick a couple of spreads and we can talk around them. I'm going to talk about volcanoes. because I had no idea. And this is the great thing about children's books today. They do not talk down to children. And an adult can pick this book up and they can learn something new too. And I knew about pumice, and that was it. But after reading this, there are so many different kinds of rocks that are
there are.
created by volcanic activity.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about some of these.
Yeah, volcanic rocks are just amazing. It's almost motion that a lot of the different types of volcanic rocks record. So I wanted to capture that in the variety of rocks we talk about on this page. So I think the very first one on the page is lava bombs. So these are projectiles that get flung through the air from the volcano. And as they're spinning through the air, as they move, it shapes the molten rock at the time into a shape of what is essentially a football. And as it comes down, it whacks the ground and generally cracks off the end. So most lava bombs, you have one end that's a little bit more blunt than the other. And the lava bomb, the rock that you then have, records this entire venture of the rock from flying from the mouth of the volcano through the air and landing on the ground. I always think that lava bombs are really interesting to find because of that. The Hawaiian term for two of these types of lava is a'a, which hurts to touch. It's very sharp. I almost said prickly, not really prickly, but it has a lot of texture to it. And then there's the pohoihoi lava, which is ropey. You can see it twist and turn, and it records that flow of the lava as it moves over the landscape. I've always thought the different types of lava are just really very beautiful. And yeah, they record all of the different processes. We also have on that page, I believe, Pele's tears, which are little drops. They're actually volcanic glass. So it's bits of lava that has been flung out of the volcano, similar to a lava bomb, but it's much, much smaller. And they cool down so quickly that the crystals don't really even have time to form. And so it forms this like very shiny volcanic glass, similar to obsidian, which is another type of volcanic glass, but much larger, kind of shiny rock. We also get Pele's hair, which is that stretching of the lava as it flows through the air because it's viscous. It's very like honey as it's coming out. And as it stretches, you get those very thin hairs that then freeze. And those are actually glass. I have a little bit of Pele's hair from a trip from Hawaii ages ago that I treasure. It's spectacular to then just imagine the process behind each one of these individual formations.
So you've been to Iceland recently, and of course Iceland's been in the news a lot because of the volcanic eruption very close to a settlement. What's the news on that?
Oh, Iceland is, yeah, it's scary. And also, it's interesting because I know scientists initially were very excited to see these eruptions because they were far from populations. It was almost what some people refer to as a tourist kind of eruption because it was far from populations. You could come up fairly close, fairly safely in various ways to see it. And it's an amazing display of Earth's power. And also scientifically, it's very fascinating because they're learning a lot about these lavas seem to come up from fairly deep, relatively unchanged, which usually lava, as it erupts, it burbles up and then it sits. And some crystals settle out and then the concentrate or the compounds in it changes over time. But they're getting these really interesting looks of composition. More recently, though, the activity has moved closer towards the cities on the southern coast of the Reykjanes Peninsula. And so there's a lot of concern for populations, and there's been a lot of back and forth of they have to leave homes whenever the volcano starts erupting, and it seems like there's risk to the population, or it seems like it's headed in their direction. It's surprising and it isn't surprising in a sense that Iceland was built by volcanoes. We know that island in of itself is there because of the volcanic activity. It's one of the few parts of the mid-ocean ridge that actually sits above the sea. And so you have the mid-ocean ridge where the two tectonic plates are pulling apart, and that allows magma to well up and erupt. The other thing that's going on actually underneath Iceland in another part of the country is that there's a hot spot sitting right underneath, so creating other melt, causing other volcanoes to erupt. And in the Reykjanes, though, there hasn't been activity for 800 years almost. The Reykjanes tends to go in long periods of quiet, and then it erupts for long periods of eruption. And whatever the cause, we don't entirely know why that is, but it seems to have this just intense periods of activity and then long periods of quiet. And we'd been in a very long period of quiet for that part of Iceland, but it seems like we've now transitioned into this period of frequent eruptions.
There are so many other gems in this book. What would you like to talk about next?
One of the spreads that I love is the Grand Canyon spread, where the rocks layers are like the pages of a book. It's one of my favorite things to discuss with rocks, about how you can read them like books almost, because each layer is so the oldest layers are at the bottom most of the time, unless something crazy has happened and the whole thing has gotten flipped over in some crazy event. But usually the oldest layers are at the bottom, and then time passes with different layers getting placed on top. And so you can actually tell the story of Earth like reading this book, as looking at the fossils in the different layers, or looking at the different types of rock in each of these layers. And I always think that it's just a very beautiful and visual way to understand how rocks can hold these stories. When we're talking about different rocks of the Grand Canyon, you have periods where these rocks were deposited on the bottom of an ocean floor, and then you have uplift. And so it's changing the types of rock sediments that are being laid down. And so you get this visual, like light tan colors that go to these darker red colors. When the land sinks again, we get more different types of ocean sediments and that sort of things.
And we should give a call out to the illustrator who's made it look so beautiful, Sonia Pulido.
She did a fantastic job with all of these spreads. We talked a lot about what should go in there, and we went back and forth on the sort of the images that I sent of what I had in mind, and then she took it and ran with it and did just a beautiful job.
How do you know the dates of these rocks?
It's a good question. There's not a simple answer to that, because it depends on where you're looking, what rocks you're looking at in the world. There are many ways that scientists can date rocks. One of them is using the shells of a tiny creature called a foram. They evolved over time to have very unique shells. And so you can actually sometimes look at the group of foraminifera that are present and use that as a rough measure of when the layers were laid down. That's one way. Another way is using isotopic compositions. That's a bit beyond my expertise of what isotopes you use where, but basically you're looking at the breakdown of these particular elements over time and using that to tell how long a rock has been there. But you have to use different elements depending on how long ago you're looking at. Some elements are only good for things that are more recent, and you can use like carbon dating, you can use for things that are geologically speaking recent. If you have bits of like plant matter or something that's in there, sometimes that can be dated. But then other types of isotopes can be used for things that are much older. So it really depends on what you're looking at.
Fascinating. I'm going to invite you to take another pick and take us further into this book.
I was thinking the sand page, I think it's often overlooked. Generally, when we think of sand, we just think of the yellow beach sand, but really there's quite a few stories that you can tell from just the sand. You can get various colors of sand all over the world. One of the things that I collect still, and I've tried to reduce my rock collecting as I travel because we had way too many boxes of rocks all over the house, but I will grab just a little bit of sand in a Ziploc wherever I go, because I've realized that I now have, I don't know, several dozen, they're like sitting on the floor here, vials of sand. And they're just a whole range of colors from like stark white all the way to black. And then we have the pinks and greens and everything in between. And it's like a little snapshot of the geology around you, because all of the sand comes from the breakdown of the surrounding material. And so in volcanic environments, you can get these beautiful, really black sands or green sands. In islands, you often get carbonate sands, which are actually from broken shell material or coral skeleton material from the creatures that live offshore. And if you put any of that under a microscope, you can see some pretty amazing things. You can get like the little spines of echinoderms or the tiniest shells. You'll often see the foram shells, which are beautiful. Some of them are really odd. They're like bubbly looking or very swirly. You can see some amazing things in sand. And so I think it's one of those things that we walk across and don't really think about. We use it in our gardens. We use it everywhere, but the actual composition of it is quite interesting and can tell you a lot about the environment in which it came from.
Next time I go for a walk on the beach, I'm going to look more closely, that's for sure. This is really all about looking closely, isn't it?
It is. I think a lot of the things in this book are very much about just stopping to appreciate what is there and to take another look. One of the things that my guest said to me recently, which I like almost cried. It was wonderful. We were in Iceland and we were in Reykjavik initially to start with. And then at the end of the trip, we returned to Reykjavik. And she said to me, Mai, I saw this mountain off in the distance when we first visited Reykjavik. And at the time I thought, oh, that's a pretty mountain. But now after I've spent this whole time with you and you've told us all these other stories, I look at that mountain differently. Like it's not just a mountain anymore. And I was just like, oh my gosh, that's music to my ears. That's really what I'm trying to do with everything that I'm writing, whether it's books for kids or travel guiding or writing articles, is really to try to get people to slow down a little bit and think deeper about the landscape that surrounds them and the long history that's led up to the ground we're standing on.
I just want to go to one more page in the book, which
Yeah, of course.
was so intriguing to me. It was something that I'd never heard of before. We're looking at these strange kinds of mounds in
Oh, the stromatolites.
Australia.
I have too many random fun facts, but one of my favorite fun facts is that some of our earliest life was just slime. They were these mats of slime, and they were microbes that bathed in the shallow waters, and they would photosynthesize, so they like to have light, but occasionally would get covered by sand. And when they did get covered by sand, these little microbes would then grow up through the sand so that they could then have their light again. And then they get covered by sand again and grow up a little bit more. And also they could create their own minerals. Some of the reactions that they did would sometimes make layers of calcium carbonate. And in addition to all of that, it would form these lumpy mound looking things. And that is the earliest life that we know of. These are called stromatolites when they're in fossil form. And you can actually find rock stromatolites and cut them in half and see all of those tiny little crinkly layers. But you can visit some of their modern relatives today. And this picture is based off of a site off the coast of Australia where there's cyanobacteria mats that form into these remarkable mounds. And when you're looking at this, you're looking at some of our earliest ancestors. They're really very cool.
Amazing. That's on my wish list to go and visit. I want to kind of get some ideas for practical activities for bringing that study to life.
The things that always caught my attention in classes growing up was always when we can get out in nature. And I know that isn't always possible in a classroom environment. I think that it's so valuable for kids to be able to go out into their environment and ask questions, to look at things. We'll start with a rock and look at this rock. What do you notice about this? You don't have to live into a volcanic landscape to have an exciting history for where you live. There really are these histories no matter where you are in the world. I went to Montessori school, which is based in hands-on activities. And I think rocks and geology and earth science lend themselves very much to hands-on activities. Back in my hometown, and I'm doing a series of events with kids where I'm bringing a variety of different minerals and we're going to test all the properties of them. The pumice that we talked about, it floats on water. A different mineral called amber actually sinks when you put it on water, but it floats if you put it on salt water. And it's all these like really interesting properties of these things that I think are really fun to test. Calcium carbonate, if you drop a little bit of like lemon juice on it, something acidic, it'll fizz, whereas other rocks won't do that. We have other rocks, minerals like fluorite that'll glow. And you can learn about the properties of these different minerals or different types of rocks by playing around with them and exploring them. Kids are like little scientists. They're constantly trying to test their environment and test the properties of everything, whether or not they know it. They're constantly trying to like play around with things. And I think that geology and earth science in general is a great environment to do that because a lot of it is very physical.
And you mentioned early microscopes. What sorts of things can you look at through microscopes?
You can look at things like sand because you can find a lot of interesting things, particularly in carbonate sands, because those tend to have more animal inputs into them. Geologists make what they call thin sections of rock. So they take a rock and cut it, polish it down, and then take a glass slide and glue it to it and then polish it down until it's like super paper thin. And those can actually be used when you have a microscope that has a light that goes through it. Also with rocks in general, you might not even need a microscope. You can look at large hand samples of rock just with a hand lens. So having hand lenses to be able to actually look at some of the crystals and look at how they grow together or look at the different colors and that sort of thing. You can do that just with a hand lens.
Final question.
Yeah.
Should children be encouraged to build rock samples, or should they leave rocks where they are?
That's a tough one. It depends on where you are. Of course, a lot of national parks, a lot of places don't want you to take rock samples because you want to leave them where everyone can enjoy them. But in other places, when you're not in these sort of protected environments, I collect rocks and I think that it's okay for kids to collect rocks. Of course, you don't want them bringing home buckets and buckets of rocks, but oftentimes my souvenir from a place is a pretty rock that I've found somewhere. And when I was a kid, I did build up quite an extensive rock collection over time. I think it's just important to talk to students and kids about like where it's okay to collect samples and what samples are okay to take. And I always think that it's important to discuss respecting the landscape that you're in. The rocks that I pick up are ones that I can pick up that are already on the ground. It makes me sad when I'm hiking around and I see an area where someone looks like they've whacked a beautiful outcrop and they've taken a hammer to it. Scientists will collect small samples from outcrops when they need to and use a rock hammer, but I think that's a very different process than someone walking around finding a rock that they like and just whacking it to pieces. So there's a certain respect for the landscape that I think it's important to have, but encouraging kids to collect where is appropriate to collect and in ways that are appropriate to collect is perfectly fine.
Brilliant. Maya, thank you so much for dropping into the Reading Corner today and telling us all about what a rock can reveal. Your chat has certainly been very revealing, and I'm going to go away more observant with my hand lens and not dismiss the ground that I'm working on. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.